Good evening. This is Tara Miller, Lapham, and I am going to be presenting a summative assessment data analysis on one of our sixth grade science classrooms. According to Bernhardt's Data Analysis for Continuous School Improvement, page 211, she states that summative assessments provide the bottom line of learning as related to and established grade level standards. The summative or outcome assessments are used for student screening, accountability, and pre and post measures of the program. So, what I decided to look at was the beginning and the ending of teaching a unit that covered climate and weather, atmospheric layers, and heat and transfer. The goal was to identify the learning gains, instructional gaps, and next steps for instruction. Taking a look at the pre and post test data, I utilized some questions that are found inside Fisk's Leading Data Informed Change in Schools on page 92. These questions start the conversations, promote thinking, and data conclusion. We're going to be looking at what we noticed about the data, what it was telling us. Did it measure correctly? Was it reliable? What did the data tell me about the student progress? And maybe what are some ways that the teacher can go about reintroducing or re-instructing the kids on the data that they missed in the testing or according to the testing. We're also going to be looking at some questions that are in that problem-solving circle on page 107 of Bernhardt's Data Analysis for Continued School Improvement, such as maybe who are the students that are not performing? Is he teaching the standards up to par? What was the impact of his instruction? Things that maybe he needs to think about when he takes a look at the test scores. So the number of students that were tested in the pre-test were 21. There was one student that was absent. And in the post-test, there were 22 students tested. Content areas assessed were climate and weather, atmospheric layers, heat, and transfers. The pre-test showed, obviously, that the kids were not familiar with the data that was going to be covered in the unit, and they averaged a score of 22%, ranging anywhere from 0% or a score of 0 up to a score of 67 in some areas. The post-test average score was a 67, and while it was not passing, it did show an overall class improvement of 45% in scores from pre-test to post-test. So I want to take a look at these pre-test scores. In looking at the pre-test scores, the average scores for your assessment overall, 6 was the low, 45 was the high. For climate and weather, it was the same. 6 was your low score, 45 was your high score. In looking at atmospheric layers, there was some scores of 0, ranging all the way up to, it looks like a 45 or a 42. And then for heat and transfer, the score ranges again from 0 up to 45. So they were pretty low. The kids were not real familiar with the information that was going to be presented in the unit. After instruction, looking at post-test results, there were those students that still struggled. Overall, the entire assessment, there were students that made a low of a 20, while there was students that made as high as 96. In climate and weather, the breakdown was a low score of 20, high of 96, atmospheric layers score of 27, high of 100, and then in heat and transfer, low score of a 15 up to a high of 100. Now, overall, the assessment showed that 22.7% of students scored below average on the entire test, 9% in the average range, and 68% in the above average range. And that was for the overall test. When you break it down into climate, atmosphere, and heat transfer, we're going to take a look at those key findings. So under climate and weather, the key findings were that students demonstrated the strongest improvement in this area. However, there were a small group of students that still scored below expectations, indicating a need for additional support. When you look at the percentage breakdowns of the climate and weather assessment, you had 22.7 students below average, 9% students average, and 68% of the students that were above average. Moving to atmospheric layers. The performance here was varied. Some students did make notable gains while others showed minimal progress. When you broke it down into percentages, 54.5% of students fell below average, and 45.5% of students came out above average. Moving on to the heat transfer, this area exhibited the most inconsistent improvement, suggesting the need for enhanced instructional strategies. It was about 50-50. 50% of students scored below average, 50% of students scored above average. But the range of scores for this particular subset of information was a wider variety from like 15 to 100. So now we're going to just take a look at the instructional gaps. The identified instructional gaps, the assessment data highlights several instructional gaps that were addressed or needed to be addressed. Of course, reinforcement of heat transfer concepts because students showed a lower improvement rate in this area, suggesting a need for a more targeted instruction. A need for differentiated instruction. While the overall performance did improve, some students showed minimal growth, indicating a need for maybe personalized learning approaches. Assessment alignment was also highlighted as a need where some test items might not fully have been aligned with the instructional content. Maybe the teacher needs to go back and make sure that the questions on the test aligned with the instruction that the children were receiving during the unit. Also, instructional support needs to be identified, maybe reteaching strategies, focusing on interventions, providing the students who were struggling with some additional key concepts, hands-on visual learning projects. The teacher could add to the unit test that was delivered or the unit instruction that was delivered, where students could get a hands-on and visual of heat and how exactly it transfers, and maybe even throw in some small group instruction. Um, and of course, um, maybe adding on a few more formative assessments along the way. So, again, targeted reteaching, hands on learning, small group instruction, and adding in a few more formative assessments to maybe gauge where the students are in the learning process. I think that regular check-ins, regular assessments, when we're talking about formative assessments, gives that teacher a bit of a monitor step by step, and allows that teacher to adjust the instruction accordingly as he goes when he sees that students are missing things. And in conclusion, I do think that the summative results indicated that the instructional strategies overall that were implemented were effective in improving student understanding. However, there was possibility that a refinement is needed to address some instructional gaps, particularly in the heat transfer. Um, he could possibly focus more on targeted reteaching and some differentiated instruction, adding into those steps some periodic formative assessments to make sure that the students are picking up that information. Um, he wants to make sure that he is ensuring that the students are continuing to grow and succeed with the data, um, so that they can successfully move on to the next unit. Um, I do think that instructional methods, enhancement, heat transfer, focus, and ongoing data analysis and instructional adjustments will be essential in him achieving comprehensive student mastery. It was very interesting to be able to take down and take apart the data that I received from the teacher as far as the pre and post tests go. Um, I'm not sure he spent a lot of time on the unit. Now, when we go back to page 107 in Bernhardt's data analysis for continuing school improvement, one of the questions that is in the problem solving cycle um, is maybe what kinds of students, who are the students who are not performing? And his class um, is a class that is an inclusion taught class. So there are those students in his class with special needs that do require a little bit more of a breakdown, maybe slower processing for some of his students that he has within the classroom. Um, so, what I do know about those students is they tend to need a little bit more instruction and a little bit more hands on to be able to achieve mastery of student content, of teaching content and subject area content. Um, the teacher and I had a discussion at the end of this. He came into my office and we sat down and we went over the data and we talked about areas that he saw that maybe he needed to redo and go back and improve, um, which was the point of us breaking down the data for that particular class. Um, but overall, we do both think that the students did get a grasp on the concepts, and hopefully he'll be able to go back and reteach some of the heat transfer before he has to move on to the next um, standard that has to be taught within his science class. But I did enjoy it. I was able to use both books and several different charts and questions within the books to go through the data analysis. It's giving me a broader understanding of exactly what goes into data analysis. And that is all I have for our summative data analysis of the sixth grade science class.